Hi, everybody. I hope you're all good today. Uh, we're going to talk about biodiversity and then move into more ecosystem stability. How do we know when losses of biodiversity can destabilize ecosystems? Or, why is biodiversity important to system stability? I have quite a bit to cover today, so I'm going to move fairly quickly, but and then just probably take a 5 minute break around noon. So yeah, anyway, hope you enjoy the lecture. So yeah, we have lots of things to cover. Basically, I'm going to be talking about these measures of biodiversity, things you've probably heard before, and we'll just define what these things mean. Like, how do we measure biodiversity? What is richness, diversity, evenness? There's different types that we talk about at the local level and at broad scales. And then there's a whole bunch of ecological factors that naturally affect biodiversity, including people. We affect biodiversity in a big way too. And this affects ecosystem stability. So I'll define what we mean by that, and sort of distinguish between two aspects of stability, which is resistance to disturbance, and then resilience, which is the ability to recover. And I'm going to talk more deeply about this cup and ball model that I've been referring to throughout the course so that you see what I mean by that. And then I'm going to talk about, there's not all species are created equal, if you will, in how loss of those species affect ecosystem stability. Okay, so let's go ahead and start on this. Um, Before I get going, I'm going to finish up, of course, what I didn't get to last class. I had a slide or two left. But this still fits in with what we're talking about today, in that, we talk about individual species, but in biodiversity, and we really in science have focused a lot on individual species and populations. But in reality, forests are communities of species. There are many species working together, and we've talked about, how they have this structure. They structure ecosystems. And they're organized in different ways. So one of the ways that we've talked about is that they're organized into food webs. And food webs are just species in different niches that feed on each other. And as they go through this food chain of eating, or as energy passes through this food chain, it diminishes as it goes up the food chain. So we can understand the niche of species in that food chain. We're all people are part of that food chain too. We're like top carnivores and herbivores in these food chains. We can also look at species structures according to their spatial topology, what you might think of as topology, or what is the spatial structure to this? And I talked about, as an example, mycorrhizal networks, which is something I study, these mycorrhizal fungi that can actually link species together. They also feed into food webs, but they can actually physically link trees in space, and it helps us understand there's a topology, or if you will, a topography even, to how species are interacting in space. And we can also think about this other thing called interaction webs, which combines energy transfers and the topology together. And so I was giving you the example last time of this interaction web, which is this was a study that was done in the eastern hardwood forests of the United States, where they were looking at reciprocal relationships between birds that were feeding frugivores, basically eating the fruits of different plants and trees. So this is a forest that's comprised of honeysuckle, hawthorn, yew, and barberry. And these are the Latin names underneath here. And they're supporting, or their homes or habitats for these birds, the blackcap, the redwing, and the robin. And these scientists were able to look at how much interdependence there was between each tree or plant species and the frugivores, the birds that were feeding on their fruits. And by measuring, the energy transfer between the trees or the plants and the birds, they were able to develop these interaction this interaction web or this interaction network. And they depicted the strength of those interactions by these arrows. So if the arrow is a thick arrow, it means it's a strong interdependence. And if it's a narrow arrow, it's a light interdependence. And the darkness of these arrows is the dependence of the plant on the herbivore, or sorry, the dark one is the dependence of the frugivore on the plant, and the light of the frugivore, the plant on the frugivore. You know, they're not they can be symmetrical, in other words, equal interdependence, or they can be asymmetrical, that the bird may be more dependent on the plant or vice versa. So you can see here in the hawthorn and the redwing that the redwing is more dependent on the plant than the plant is on the redwing. The plant has other frugivores that will disperse its fruit for us. So you can see it's also got a good, healthy relationship and interdependence with the blackcap. So these kinds of interaction webs really help us understand better about the social structure, not the spatial and structure parts, sort of like the spatial and horizontal structure of the ecosystem, but also the energy transfers. Okay, so I have a polling question. It's actually polling question 1, not 5, but it is, what type of social structure indicates the interaction strength between species? Okay, so it is this interaction network. So here's our polling question.
Stars. Done. It's perfect.
Okay, good job, everybody. Okay, so why is this stuff important? Do people actually look at this? And they do. So this is an example of a study that was published last year in 2024. And it was looking at these interaction networks. So this was done in the tropical rainforest of Indonesia. And they were comparing food webs between natural intact rainforest. So you can see on the left-hand side of this photo, there's a nice diverse rainforest, tropical rainforest. And on the right-hand side is a forest that's been converted to, I think it's a rubber plantation. So I'm just going to read to you this study, and I'm going to show you some of the results of their study. So it says, every day new areas of rainforest are being converted to plantations, drastically changing tropical biodiversity and the way the ecosystem functions. Yet our current understanding of the consequences are fragmentary. Previous studies tend to examine either biodiversity or the ecosystem. Okay, they either studied, these food webs or topological webs, but not together. So an international research team led by this university tried to bring these things together. They analyzed organisms ranging from microscopic mites and earthworms in the soil to beetles and birds in the tree canopies, and compared the tropical rainforest with rubber and oil palm plantations in Sumatra, Indonesia. Their findings provide first insights into the processing of energy across soil and canopy animal communities in these mega biodiverse tropical ecosystems. They demonstrate that the conversion of rainforests into plantations erodes and restructures food webs and interaction webs and fundamentally changes the way they function. So let's take a look at this. They did a beautiful job with this paper. So this is a nice graphic that shows this interaction web in a rainforest. So this is in the intact tropical rainforest. And you can see there's all these different creatures that are represented by, or these groups of creatures, functional groups of creatures, with similar functions by these dots. So the ones up here are the canopy arthropods. Those are the blue ones, the green ones by the birds, the pink ones by soil arthropods, and then some orange ones, which are the earthworms. And then these arrows, or these lines that go between the organisms and different parts of the plant. So this is living tissue, this is litter. In this this circle with all the leaves on the ground, and then these are fungi, which are saprotrophs. And so they're just looked at the energy flow from these living plants in these different groups of organisms and all of the creatures in the food web. So here you can see that strongly that living plants fed the soil food web down here. They also had strong linkages to canopy arthropods and sort of weaker linkages, but still strong linkages to the birds. The saprotrophs, which are, decaying the litter, they both had strong linkages to the soil community. Okay, so this is a really lovely, illustration of an interaction web that's way more sophisticated than the one in the Eastern Hardwood Forest I gave you the example of earlier. This is just more advanced research, people able to dissect this community more closely. And then they looked at how this tropical rainforest in this next slide, which is on the left, it's this very diverse forest where you've got lots of species, and how that compared with the jungle rubber, which is more, semi-natural, the rubber plantations, and then the palm oil plantations. And you can see that they've got these grouped again in the herbivores, the litter feeding organisms, the fungivores, soil feeding organisms, and you can see that the energy flows, which are depicted by the width of the line and the darkness of the lines from one group to another, it changes enormously from the intact rainforest all the way to these planted forests on the far right. So you see, and these lines, they've actually summarized these interactions in these bar graphs down below. And I'm not going to go in great detail about this, but one thing I noticed right away is that that the diversity of the colors where the energy is flowing in this ecosystem is quite evenly distributed amongst these different groups, the living plants, the litter, the saprotrophs, and so on. Whereas in these simplified plantations, you have a lot more energy that's flowing into the litter community, and what's decomposing the litter, that's these orange bars, and then the saprotrophic community, which is the gray bar. And so you've really shifted the energy of this ecosystem from, distributed throughout the canopy of the forest to really the detritus of the ecosystem, the litter that falls, and then the soil community that feeds on that litter. You could say that this simplified ecosystem has a lot more, it's feeding into a sort of a dying cycle more than it is into a living cycle. So that's really interesting. So, that helps us understand, what the impacts of our, plantations, converting tropical forests to plantations, have not only the diversity across the ecosystem, but what it's actually doing to the ecosystem energetically. Okay, so let's move on from that example and talk more about how do we actually measure and express diversity. I mean, we talk about, species and structures and functions, but there are certain measures or indexes that scientists use, and they use them universally so we can compare with each other, this language that we all know about. So I want to sort of reveal what that language is today. So, and you'll have heard of some of these terms. So measures of diversity, I'm going to explain what these things are, richness, evenness, and so on, and then scales of diversity, alpha, beta, and gamma. And so that when you're looking at a forest like this is the Tongass National Forest in Alaska. When we're looking at a forest like this, when we have the language to describe it, we have kind of a universal language that everybody can understand. And then we can compare where the diversity is in that ecosystem compared to another ecosystem. We can compare over time if we lose that diversity by looking at these different measures. And so, when you're looking at this forest, you can automatically see that there's different aspects of diversity in here that we've talked about. There's species diversity. This is, we've got hemlocks and spruces and devil's club and mosses. We have horizontal diversity. We've got gaps in this forest, and we have areas of dense forest. We have understory regeneration. And then we have different functions. We have energy transfers through thinning of trees, the trees laying down on the forest floor, and then you have this whole detritus food web feeding on that. So, we can look at this and say, yes, this is a very diverse forest. Okay. Um, and generally what we think and what ecologists think and have studied we're getting more and more evidence of this all the time, and I've talked about this earlier, is that these measures of biodiversity, of diverse forests like that in the Tongass National Forest, as the diversity increases, that we generally get an increase in ecosystem function, up to a point. At some point, as you add more and more species, you get redundancy in the ecosystem. Now, I've also talked about how redundancy is a bit of a neat misnomer in that there is no true absolute redundancy between species because of niche differentiation. But that redundancy in certain aspects of the ecosystem. So, for example, you might have many species that are fixing nitrogen, but each one might differ in, for example, their shade tolerance or their ability to take up water and so on. They have a multidimensional niche. But when you have redundancy in one or more functions, it actually provides the ecosystem stability so that if you lose one species, it can keep doing that role. But generally, we see this kind of pattern where you have an increase in the functioning of an ecosystem with increasing diversity, and then it kind of levels off because of this overlap in species functions. Also, where this diversity is working varies a lot across landscape. So that's also important. How does it function? And in these two forests, we have the rainforest in the Tongass National Forest, and then we have a little bit further to the east, not a whole lot further east, a boreal forest. And so these are both about the same latitude, but one is on the coastal ecosystems close to the Pacific, and one is more in the continental or the interior part of Canada. And even though they're latitudinally similar, they're very different because of their climate. And so, but there is one more diverse than the other. It looks like the forest on the left, which is the Tongass, is much more biodiverse than the forest on the right in the boreal, where you have much lower tree species diversity. It could be, but it's important to know that ecosystems distribute their diversity differently depending on what the limiting factors are for growth. So in the Tongass, where we have lots of water, it's relatively mild, not too cold, and it's not as cold of a climate as the boreal forest. And trees and plants, there is actually more above ground biodiversity because they're trying to, they have their limitations to water and nutrients is low, but their limitations to light becomes high as you pack in more species to take up and use those below ground resources. Okay, so this Tongass forest is allocating its diversity above ground to capture more light so it can increase biomass. On the right-hand side in the boreal forest, most of the biodiversity is actually below ground because they're trying to get at nutrients which are bound up in organic matter in the soil because of cold temperatures and which limits nutrient availability. So even though the one on the right has lower biodiversity above ground, when you look below ground, when we added these things up, they're probably not that different if you added up all the species. Okay, so yeah, it's important to look at where that biodiversity is. It also, when we express biodiversity, it differs across scales. So not just where that diversity exists in the ecosystem, but across scales. So here's a tropical rainforest. You can see on the right at the stand level, there's incredible biodiversity. You can have in the tropical rainforest 100 species of trees in 1 hectare. Unlike the boreal forest where you might have 2 or 3 species per hectare if you're lucky. But at the landscape level on the left in the Amazon rainforest, which has got a large subdued landscape, the biodiversity at those large scales is actually lower because we don't have a lot of relief in that landscape. There's not a lot of change in diversity across that big expansive area. So at the landscape level, we actually have quite low biodiversity. Okay, let's dig into that a little bit more. And I want to just bring you back to our original conversation last time or over the last couple of lectures about how we're talking about biodiversity, these different ways of looking at it. There's species, there's genotypes, there's also these, as we talked about, these different architectural and social diversity and functional diversity. So how are people expressing, each of these can be expressed in different ways. And the easiest way is to look at just the number. And so the most common thing is what we call species richness, the number of species in a community. So that's a compositional index. You could also talk about the number of genotypes in an ecosystem, which you might call that genetic richness. Or you might look at the number of layers in a forest canopy. That could be structural richness. Or you could look at the number of different vegetation types in a region. You could call that landscape richness. But richness itself is just the number of whatever that thing is that you're using to express diversity at whatever scale of interest you're interested in. Okay, so now richness is good. It gives us an idea, but it doesn't tell us everything. So here, let's look at these two communities of plants, or let's imagine that they're plants, and they're different plant species, and they're just represented by these different symbols. Now, each one of these communities, community A and B, actually has the same number of species. So here's one in A, 1, 2, 3, 4, is that 5 species? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 species. In community B, we actually have the same number of species, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 species. But you probably would argue that one of these communities is more diverse than the other, right? In community A, is dominated by this ratchet-looking species, whereas in community B, these 5 species seem to be distributed quite evenly. There's about equal numbers of them. And so richness really doesn't represent the diversity of a community very well. And so in addition to richness, people talk about the abundance of species and how they're distributed amongst the different species. So the abundance of each one, whether it's the cover, the numbers, the biomass, we can look at that abundance, and we can look at how it's distributed across these different measures of richness. Okay, so one of the ways that we do this is we use something called a diversity index. And the diversity index takes into account richness and abundance and puts it into a single measurement. And it's expressed in this index called the Shannon-Weaver Diversity Index. Now, don't worry about the math, but I just want to explain it to you so that you understand how this works. So all it is it takes each individual species and it looks at the proportion in the community. Okay, so in this community here, this one that looks like a bursting star, it represents like a certain portion. Maybe it's 5%. I don't know what it is, but it's a proportion. Let's say it's 0.05. You take that proportion and you multiply it by the log of the proportion of that species, and then you add them all up for all of the species in your community. Okay, so when you do that, what happens is that it'll show that index adds up on the left to a low number, and the one on the right a higher number. Okay, so that index then is taking into account the richness and the relative abundance in that whole community. Okay, so that's more useful than just richness. Okay, so there's another index though. So richness, or diversity is good, except that it actually is changes continuously as you add species into your community. So as you add more and more species into this community over here on the left, for example, the diversity number goes up and up and up and up. It always keeps going up as you add species. So it has a limited usefulness when comparing one community like the Tongass with another community like the boreal forest. You can't actually compare them because the Tongass forest will always have higher diversity or higher relative diversity. And so we've invented this other measure called the evenness, which actually puts it relative to the maximum diversity in that community. So it's more of the equity of of the of the species across the system. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we take basically the same index, species diversity, which is proportion times the log of proportion, and divide it by the log of the maximum diversity in that ecosystem. So all it does is it puts it on a scale from 0 to 1 instead of always increasing to infinity as you add species. Okay, I hope that wasn't too confusing. These are just measures that you'll hear about when people are describing diversity. So the most common measure that's used is evenness. It is the most useful measure of diversity. Okay, so evenness then is the distribution of the abundance of the different species making up the richness of an area. And I've got actually there's a couple of little YouTube videos down here if you're confused about this that you can watch on your own time. Okay, so we have on the left, we have a community with low evenness and one with on the right with high evenness. So the one on the left is got a lot of dominance by one species and there's a bunch of rare species. And on the right, we have a bunch of species that are equally abundant. Okay, so high evenness, you have all species have the same abundance. Low evenness, we have uh, uh, you have a few species dominating. And if you have zero evenness, you only have one species that's dominating everything. Okay, so I'll just put a little bit more detail on this. So here's our Shannon-Weaver diversity index, and here's our evenness index, which is basically just the Shannon diversity index divided by the maximum diversity. They're the same thing, but one's just a relative term. And this figure on the right just kind of illustrates why this is, just illustrates visually why this helps. So here we have the triangles or the pyramids represent Shannon's diversity index, the H. Okay, when you add numbers of species here along the x-axis from 5 to 50, and the species are all equally abundant with each other, Shannon's diversity just goes up and up and up as you add more and more species into the ecosystem. But because the evenness is relative to the number of species in the ecosystem, when we measure evenness with equal number of species, it's always the same. It doesn't matter. It's not sensitive to the number of species in the ecosystem. It's just sensitive to the relative abundance of them. So that's really, really helpful. I think that illustrates it really well. So even when we have unequal ecosystems, even when we look at diversity with unequal numbers of species, even though it's highly dominated by one species and not very diverse, that Shannon's index will continue to go up, albeit at a slower rate. So it tells you that diversity is going up, but it's actually not, even though, it's just an artifact of the measurement. Whereas the evenness measure, as you go increase in species and it becomes more and more just one species, that index actually goes down a little bit. That's a better reflection that, it's actually a declining diversity as you increase the number of species and you get greater dominance. Okay, I hope that's not too confusing. I hope it clarifies a few things. And again, if you want to understand more, you can look at those YouTube videos that I posted. Okay, so here's a question. What advantage does the measure of species evenness provide over species diversity? So I'll let you answer this. Let's see what you say.
Start. So 65% got correct in B, but 20% select C, 10% select A.
Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah, it is actually makes it easier to interpret. I think you're right that it can also be easier to communicate. I don't think any of this stuff is easy to communicate, but as long as you understand that it is a more universal, it is more easy to interpret because it's not always increasing. Okay, good. Thank you. All right, so here's our measures. We've got richness, abundance, diversity, evenness. There's two additional measures that you might hear about. One is called dominance, which is the degree to which a species is more numerous than its neighbors in a community. So we often talk about, if a species is the most abundant and it's taking up most of that diversity, is causing low diversity, actually. We call that a dominant. We have a high dominance in the community. Or if you have a number of species or a species that is quite rare, we talk about that species according to its rarity. Oops, sorry. What did I just do? I just lost here we go. So, okay, so these are all, all one, two, how many are these? There's 6 different measures here. So I'm asking you, here's a polling question. What measures are included in both species diversity and evenness? And so it includes, some of these other ones. So diversity and evenness both take into account richness and abundance, but in slightly different ways. So here's our polling question.
Start. Done. It's perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, good job. Okay, so all those measures. We can also talk about the scale of diversity. People do this all the time in the literature. So let's talk about 3 scales, spatial scales, alpha, beta, and gamma. So alpha diversity is what we call the within site or within forest or within habitat diversity. So in this figure on the right, you can imagine these circles, which has, in this case, where my arrow is, there's 4 species in this circle. This is within a site, so it has that's what is within the site is the alpha diversity. So in this case, it's got a richness of 4. That's its alpha diversity within habitat. Here we have another site. It's got 2 species, so it's actually got lower alpha diversity than this upper circle. This other one on the right has got 3 species, so they're all a bit different. So alpha diversity is just within a site. Gamma diversity is what's in the entire region. So you could imagine, 3 forest stands together with these different species. When you add up all the species that encompass all those stands in a single forest, or a forest region, that's what we call gamma diversity or landscape diversity. So in this case, the landscape diversity is actually 4. There's 4 species, just like there is in this first stand that I talked about. Okay, so it reflects the entire diversity of that environment. Of course, I'm talking about richness, right? I'm just, because it's the easiest thing for me to calculate in my head here, but we're using richness as our indicator of diversity in this case. But anyway, the main thing here is we've got within stand and then across the entire landscape, which is gamma. And then there's another measure, which is called beta diversity. And beta diversity is the change in the species composition from one stand or community to another. So beta diversity then is what's the difference between this stand here and this stand over here, and that's called the beta diversity. What's the difference between this one here and the one up here? That's beta diversity as well. Okay, so beta diversity is the change in species composition from one place to another or along an environmental gradient. from dry, let's say these represent dry to wet sites. And these are changes are due to a variety of factors, such as habitat difference, like wet versus dry, or the dispersal of species into them, or a whole bunch of other reasons could explain those differences. But beta diversity is can be calculated as the by dividing gamma diversity by the mean of the alpha diversity in that whole landscape. Okay, so you can calculate beta from gamma and alpha. Okay, so why is that useful to know? Because landscapes have all these they're variable. They vary across space. Here's a boreal landscape, and we can look at within ecosystem diversity or alpha diversity. So here in this little stand here, we've got aspen trees and spruce trees, and maybe some larch trees, maybe some balsam trees. So there might be 4 species in here. That's the alpha diversity. But then you also have quite different ecosystems right next to each other, right? So here is one relatively pure stand of spruce and subalpine fir. And over here you have a kind of a boggy area that has no trees in it, but a whole bunch of maybe uh, other species, carex species, for example. Okay, so you have quite different communities, and there's a big difference between those communities, which is beta diversity. And then you have what's in the entire landscape. You add up all the species across the whole landscape, and that gives you gamma diversity. Okay. So why is this beta diversity so important? Well, because there is a lot of variability across these landscapes. Richness or just simple measures of diversity don't just capture that. So here in this mountainous landscape, we have forest, grassland, aspen, some shrubby species along riparian areas. And if we want to describe that complexity, this is a really useful measure to do that. It gives us an idea of the spatial complexity. It gives us a better idea of the landscape diversity that's not just based on numbers of species. And so you tend to get high levels in mountainous regions where there's wetlands, riparian areas, which are for, vegetation along streams and lakes, or special habitats, or due to small scale soil and disturbance variability. Okay, so people do, express it this way to look at variability across landscapes. Okay, you can have landscapes that have, quite different. You could have a same number of species in a landscape, but they can be distributed very differently. And this is where beta diversity really, really becomes so helpful. So let's look at 2 kinds of landscapes that have equal numbers of species, but they're distributed differently across that landscape. So in this upper figure, which is kind of like the uncut tropical rainforest, if there was no plantations or anything like that, it was just left, as a natural, diverse ecosystem. And you can see that species abundance, so this could be abundance of different species across some environmental gradient. Let's say it's from, a distance. You could even think of it as a distance from point A to B, or from, say, dry to wet, from warm to cold, or whatever gradient you might think about. And these species, they kind of, they peak in certain environments or distances, and then they decline in others, where other, their neighboring, there might be another whole species that has a completely different distribution. All these species are acting independently and redistributing themselves across this environment. So at any one point, we actually have, say that you're at the point 100, you actually have a high number of species, high richness, but you also have a high richness at 400 and 600. And actually, all of these species are occurring right across this entire gradient, just in more or less abundance. So we have high alpha diversity at any point along the gradient, but that they're just continuously changing and never one completely dominating or disappearing. Then we say we have low beta diversity. This landscape doesn't look that heterogeneous because of this sort of, even though it's got high within stand diversity across the entire landscape, it looks like low. It's low. It doesn't have big changes. Whereas down below, we have big changes in species distributions across our environmental gradient. We have this community at 100 is completely different than the one at 400 because some species have completely disappeared. So we say it has low alpha diversity, low numbers of species, but actually it's got high beta diversity because there's big changes across that landscape. Okay, great. Okay, so here's a polling question. What is the difference between alpha and beta diversity?
Start. So we have 55% for B, 20% for A, 15% for C.
Okay. Yeah, it is quite confusing. So I want you to think about that a little bit more. So within an ecosystem or within a stand is alpha diversity, and the change between ecosystems is beta diversity. And gamma diversity is the entire landscape. So it's definitely B. Yeah. So yeah, think about that a little bit more. All right. Now let's go on to these measures to what is creating this biodiversity across, in ecosystems. And I have, this is a topic that biologists, ecologists have, spent their careers. What causes biodiversity? What causes it to change? And you could do whole courses just on this one factor. But I'm going to just cover it in a few minutes. And I'm only going to talk about what causes diversity within communities and not across latitudes. But there is lots of info on the latitudinal changes as well. And we have touched on various reasons for number 2 over this course, but let's just focus on within a community. Why is it that so many species live together? Why do they coexist? So let's just talk about some of the reasons. One is just that there's a lot of variability at small scales. In a forest, let's say in a forest stand, even as you're, and imagine you're out taking your photos, right? You're looking at this in your photo exercise, where you're going out to the forest and looking at an ecosystem, and you can see that, species packed together, and some favor, some really like low spots in the topography, and some like high spots in the topography. Some are really good at living in hot and very wet areas, and some in dry areas. They have their different niches. And so that microtopography really shapes biodiversity. When you have lots of variation, you have lots of variation in species. SMR and SNR, that just means soil moisture regime or soil nutrient regime. How much moisture and nutrients do they love to have? Are they good at growing in? Other things in the forest, like, canopy gaps. Is there a light gap? Is there a log? Are there other imprints in the forest? Maybe there's a small disturbance created by an animal, that might create a niche for some other species to grow on, some species that love disturbed areas. All of these things create room for more species. Here's a canopy gap on the right here in this photo. What was in the forest before the last disturbance? The seeds, the legacies, the bud banks, what's in the soil already. That is really important to this small scale diversity. As time goes on, as succession goes on, you tend to accumulate biodiversity because you have more fine scale disturbance gaps in the forest. And or even just chance, chance that a seed came in or a bird flew over and and pooped and left a seed there. All of these things affect this fine scale diversity. When you have species accumulating like this, that are filling their different niches, whether it's in a gap or a disturbed spot on a log, whatever their niche is, when we pack in species like that, that's called niche assembly in ecological language. Okay, another thing that creates diversity are ecotones. Ecotones are transition areas between adjacent ecosystems. In this photo on the right, between the forest and the grassland below, and this is in the Fraser Canyon, if you've ever been there, that transition zone between the forest and the grassland is called an ecotone. So it's just transition area between adjacent ecosystems. It can be a gradual blending of communities, or it can be quite sharp. This case, it's actually, in some places it's quite sharp. And you can see that in some areas it's quite feathered in. And these trees are actually following where the water is flowing. So that's creating a broader, more feathered ecotone. And these transition areas can be due to many factors. It could be due to water, temperature, could be soils, it could be disturbance factors, all kinds of reasons. But one thing that ecotones have in common is that there's usually unique species that live there. They prefer ecotones. The marbled murrelet is a really great example of an ecotonal species. It lives, in high old growth forests where they can go out and catch their prey in the ocean, but come back to the forest where they build their nests to have their offspring. So yeah, certain species will only grow or live in these ecotonal areas. They can be sites where new species will come in. If you create an ecotone through fire or, even through human disturbances, you can create habitat for new species to come in. They tend to have a higher diversity because in these habitats, species can find many of their needs are met in these areas. They can get food and they can also get cover, for example. Um, a lot of rare and endangered species live in ecotones. So the marbled murrelet is one example, which is an endangered species. They're also interesting in that a lot of energy moves across ecotones. So energy in the form of species moving and migrating, for example, but also energy flows, like wind flows down through these ecotones and it can be slowed down or sped up. Fire is another, place where that's energy moving through the landscape. Fire will slow down when it gets into the grassland and speed up in the forest, for example. So they're very complex places of rapid change, high species diversity. Okay, so why are ecotones? Then I've got a polling question. Because of all these reasons that these, rare species, endangered species, high species diversity are all reasons why ecotones are areas of high conservation value. So let's look at the polling question.
Start. It's perfect.
Oh, good for you guys.
Yeah.
Perfect. Great. Okay, I'm just going to go through a few more slides and then we'll take a break. Another factor that is really correlated with diversity or richness of species is just productivity. You tend to get more species, higher numbers of species in more productive ecosystems. So coastal ecosystems, tropical ecosystems, there's just a lot of, a lot of resources that many species can live on and live on each other, invite each other. You get a lot of complementarity in these very productive ecosystems. And I just put this map of British Columbia here because just to show the most productive biodiverse regions are in these coastal regions where it is the most productive forest. Okay, another interesting thing about tropical diversity, which is so different than our northern latitude forests, is that because of this warmer, wetter climate, there's a lot of pathogens in these forests, and pathogens actually are really strong, or at least they're thought to be very strong determinants of biodiversity. And this is encompassed in what this long known hypothesis, it's been around for decades, called the Jansen-Connell hypothesis. And people have been, studying this. Is it really a hypothesis? Is it true? And there's just a lot of validation for this hypothesis the more people look at it. But it tries to explain this diversity in tropical ecosystems. And let me explain this graph. So you have a tree, and as you go away from that parent tree, um, there is a seed distribution, and seeds tend to be distributed. So the probability that you'll find a seed right close to that tree, it declines exponentially as you move away from the tree. Okay, that's actually true no matter where you go. All forests are like that. Seeds fall near their parents. Apple doesn't fall that far from the tree. um, but the seedlings that survive actually they survive away from the parent trees, right? They're actually quite distant from the parent trees, and so other species will come in and occupy the area around their parent trees. So the recruitment of the offspring is actually quite a distance away from the parent tree. And why is that? Well, it's because in these wet, warm ecosystems, you have a lot of pathogens. And parents will, increase their pathogen load over time. The older the parent is, the more infections it has. And they hover in the roots and the stems. And so they can actually transmit those pathogens, those illnesses onto their offspring. And so offspring tend to then regenerate further away. They'll disperse their seeds, but the ones close to the parents actually die from those pathogens. And so that is why they think that, you look down here, it looks like all these different tree species in this right-hand picture. Here's a kapok tree, and it's quite far away from this other kapok tree, and they might be related, but they didn't, regenerate right close to each other, probably because the parent had a pathogen load around it. Okay, so we have a polling question. What factor best explains the high diversity in tropical forests? Okay.
Start. So 30% A, 15% B, 50% E.
Okay. Yeah, so it is both, right? It's both. The climate is conducive to the pathogens. All right, I know that was a bit tricky. Okay, and I'm going to keep cruising along here because I'd like to get through, and I apologize if you have to go to the bathroom, if you can just hold it till the end of the lecture, and we'll just keep going today. So another hypothesis that ecologists have come up with is called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And this hypothesis says that you have the highest diversity in a plant community or ecosystem at intermediate levels of disturbance. So when you have, high disturbance or right after a disturbance, or where it's really severe or large, there's not a lot of species there because, they're burned over quickly, or it's really severe, or, so you tend to have low diversity. And at the other end, where you have really, it's been a long time since a disturbance, and then one species might start to dominate, or the disturbances are tiny, they don't create a lot of space for new things to come in. Then they say there's low diversity, and that in between, that's where you have the most diversity. So in temperate forests, that's probably, true. Here we have a forest that's had a mixed severity disturbance regime. You can see some trees have died due to fire. Others, just a few, individual trees have maybe succumbed to, maybe a little bit of fire moving through the roots. You have other places of high severity fire. But overall, in this landscape, you have quite a lot of structural and species diversity here. And so, yeah, so fire really does, in this case, when it's in a mixed severity fire regime, where it's not too severe and it's not too frequent, that you get this kind of intermediate, fairly high level of biodiversity. Okay, so here's our polling question. What factor best explains high beta diversity in temperate forests?
Start. 55% correct for C, but like 25% should choose B.
Okay. right. Because, they do interact. Yes, they do interact, but I was focusing on fire there. Okay. All right. Kind of a tricky question. All right. Also, another reason people think that diversity uh, what causes increasing diversity is just time. And so, you notice that some of these hypotheses sort of contradict each other. So there's no single, you have to consider all these things together. But generally, what we find in forests is that the older the forest is, the more there is richness of species. So this is looking at epiphytes, time since disturbance, or number of tree species, time since disturbance. They're taking a lot of different studies together and putting them into this kind of a meta-analysis to show these trends. So that's generally true. An older forest has higher diversity. Okay, then there's people. And this is I just put this slide together today because we often I think ecologists, especially conservationists, have kind of ignored people and their role in ecosystems for a long time. I think in North American ecology, if you look back at the early ecologists, they kind of ignored people in the whole equation. They felt like an ecosystem arose on its own. But in fact, people have been shaping ecosystems for a long time. Um, and, I'm showing you kind of a negative thing here that, as human population has increased over time, um, that species extinctions have followed along. People can have a fairly negative impact on ecology. We know that we're in the sixth mass extinction of the world, they say, because of the impact of human exploitation of ecosystems, global change, urban development, oil and gas, all these things do affect species diversity. But I want to emphasize that people also can have a very positive effect on ecosystems and biodiversity. And so, you know, there's different actions that can be taken to mitigate the losses. And this figure from the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity is sort of ranking and offering, what we can do to mitigate and losses and recover. And so there's saying I think we know all these things: reduce consumption, do sustainable forestry practices and agricultural practices, for example, cut pollution, especially global or greenhouse gas pollution, act on climate change, conserve and restore ecosystems. I don't think these are ranked in by what is the best or the worst, but it just gives you an idea that we can actually mitigate a lot of the losses by good activities. And in the next lecture, we're going to have a guest, Dr. Teresa Ryan, and she's an Indigenous scholar. She is a salmon fishery scientist. She's a close colleague of mine, and she's going to demonstrate to you how people, particularly Indigenous people, have created and fostered biodiversity in their territories for millennia in a very positive way. And actually, we all have this capability of thinking this way and acting in this way. And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned so that we can actually, reverse or mitigate some of these big changes, these big losses. I want you to, make sure you come and listen very carefully to what she has to say. She's actually going to give 2 lectures in this course on this topic. And just to give you an idea of like, what do I mean? What is the extent of this? Well, Indigenous people, there's a represent about 6% of the population of the world. There's about 400 million Indigenous people in the world, about the population of the United States. That's a lot of Indigenous people, but they live, it's actually only 6% of our total population, but they occupy about 20%, or they have sovereignty in 20% of their territories. They have rights and title to these territories. And it turns out that 80% of the world's biodiversity occurs on their land under their stewardship practices. And so there's a lot to learn from how they view the world and how they tend the resources. And I would venture that there are reasons for this, and Dr. Ryan will go into this, but it really is based on the worldview, how we look at and view systems, how we respect them, how we treat them, how we feel a responsibility towards our stewardship practices. So anyway, I think it will give you a great deal of optimism and hope, and know that there are things that we as people can do to really enrich diversity in ecosystems. And here's an example of things that we're worried about, of course, but we don't, we don't have to see these mass extinctions that keep coming up in the news. This is one from The Guardian from 2023, and it's a news article. It says, ecosystem collapse, it's inevitable unless we reduce or we mitigate losses of biodiversity. They're worried, scientists are worried that ecosystems, because of mass extinctions, can suddenly tip over and degrade into different states. Um, they call this the Permian Triassic Extinction event. There is one that happened 252 million years ago called the Great Dying. It was caused by global warming. And that was due to these huge volcanic eruptions that wiped out 95% of the life on Earth. And the scientists are saying we need to pay attention to this because we're actually losing species at the same order of magnitude, but it's happening at a much faster rate because of climate change, and also because of loss of habitat. And they conclude that that this loss of biodiversity that we're seeing could be, a harbinger for ecosystem collapse. I personally think that, yes, we're seeing this. It's a warning sign, but we have a lot of agency in not allowing this to happen. Okay, but I'm going to just use this as a stepping off points to talk about ecosystem collapse a little bit. What do we mean by that? And the other, corollary to that is what makes an ecosystem stable? Okay, so let's get into this for a few minutes. So ecosystem stability, it's a concept. It's just the ability of an ecosystem to maintain itself, its structures and functions over long periods of time. And it can have disturbances, normal disturbances that land within the range of natural variability. And so they're constantly changing, but that doesn't mean they're not stable. They're stable, but over longer periods of time. And all ecosystems experience change and disturbance. So how do we recognize a collapse versus a stable ecosystem? How can we conceptualize this? And how do we do this when we're looking at vastly different ecosystems? We try to, relate using measures like richness, diversity, evenness. How can we tell if one system is more stable than another? How do we get our heads around this? And so scientists have come up with all these different terminologies and measures to try and get, try to be able to communicate with each other about these things. Oops. And have really started with engineering and said, okay, engineers deal with stability and collapse all the time. Think bridges and railroads and roads and that sort of thing. And so they actually came up with a bunch of terminology that ecologists have adopted. And so ecologists now talk in terms of things like resistance, which for ecosystems, which is the ability of an ecosystem to maintain its normal structures and functions, even when conditions change. Okay, resistance, you can think of, do you resist a disease? Do you, if you're a tree and you're very stiff and the wind comes along and you just stand straight, you're resisting the wind. You're not snapping, you're resisting it. Another way of thinking of stability is resilience. You could bend and change with whatever that disturbance is, but you can bounce right back. And so we talk about resilience, which is the ability of the ecosystem to shift and change, but recover its normal structures and functions after some disturbance. Okay, so all forests and people too have these elements of stability. We have resistance and we have resilience. Okay, and I've referred a lot to this cup and ball model before I talk about the cup, right, of ecosystem stability. I introduced this earlier, but let's look at resistance and resilience. So in our cup and ball model, where we have, imagine this cup as an ecosystem. And it can occur in different states depending on its successional status, for example. The state is represented by this little ball inside of the cup. Okay, so in an ecosystem, we can think of the stability or the resistance of the ecosystem as how steep the wall of the cup is. So whether it's going to, the state is going to change a lot, then the steepness of the cup will determine, or it's a representation of that amount of change. And it's generally resistance is correlated with productivity, that when you have a higher productivity ecosystem, you tend to have higher resistance. Okay, all these models have got their flaws and weaknesses and strengths. Resilience, that other component of ecosystem stability, which is the amount of, how the ability of that ecosystem to recover. In engineering, they talk about it's the energy that ecosystem can absorb without completely changing into an entire type of ecosystem, being like, in this case, the alternative stability domain. Okay. I know these are not perfect, but resistance is the depth of the cup. It's the ability to resist a massive change, just, stay the same. Or resilience, the ability to recover, is the width of the cup. And the width you can think of it even as species diversity, numbers of species. The more species, the more resilient a system is. Okay, so here's a polling question. What stability parameter does the depth of the cup represent?
Start. I think it should be very clear, but like still 35% choose A.
Okay, so the depth of the cup is the resistance, how much the system can resist change, and the resilience is the width. It's how its ability to recover, for the ball to bounce back to the middle of the cup. Okay, I know it's kind of confusing, but yeah. All right. So how's another way to help think about this? So the resistance of an ecosystem, the depth of the cup, the ability for it to withstand change. Oops, I'm sorry about this. Ah, what happened to that slide? Yes, here we go. That's the depth of the cup. So yeah, its ability to resist it completely changing into an entirely different ecosystem. The more productive a system is, the more ability it's able to resist. But the more variable an ecosystem is, the more species that it contains. And you can think of as a system is used to disturbance, and there's a bunch of species coming and going with succession, it tends to be more resilient because it's used to those kinds of disturbances. So if you have a wide cup, it's a very resilient system, many species that can help the system recover. Okay, so the width of the cup represents the resilience. So let's try this polling question again. What stability factor does the width of the cup? I'm sorry, I've got this backwards. It should be the width of the cup. What stability factor does the width of the cup represent?
Yeah, it starts. Yeah, it's perfect now.
Okay,
Okay.
good. All right, great. Thanks. All right, there's other components of stability that people talk about. Durability, the ability of a system to cope with chronic stress, the robustness, the ability of a system to recover or maintain in the face of chronic stress. These are also terms people use to describe stability. Um, and ecosystem stability is uh, influenced by species diversity. So in different ways. And I'm actually thinking, because it's 3:19 and I'm getting tired, that I'm going to wait to talk about this until I see you next. So let's just stop there. And so next time you're going to have Dr. Teresa Ryan coming in to speak with us about Indigenous knowledge systems, and then I will see you. I'll be at the lecture on Wednesday as well, but I'll see you and I'll finish this up on the following Monday. So everybody have a good afternoon. Thank you for persisting through that long lecture. Have a great afternoon. Okay.